There is another story, a second story, manufactured coercion, and that is the story we tell about large, powerful corporate actors that is every bit as much an illusion as the dispositionist story. And that story is that the major, powerful actors in our society have no real ability to change the system.
If we make any moral judgments, and of course we do, it can only be because we have some innate concept of morality.
And yet when you get to law and you get to legal education, you will find zero conversation about justice.
What's happening to the institutional framework in which we live that is causing the population to lose any faith in its legitimacy?
This is a moment, an opportunity, the very opportunity that Samuel Alito doesn't want you taking seriously. An opportunity to reimagine the system.
So the real point, I think, is the lack of justice helps create disorder.
We know that those advantaged in our system will fight to maintain their advantage. And they will use force where manufactured consent before that had done the trick.
To get a job and spend your waking life at the service of a master.
This is a time to come together, to organize, to build institutions, to work in coalitions, to try to push back.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our keynote speech. My name is Eleftheria Papadaki. I'm an SJD candidate here at Harvard Law School, where I'm working on a theory of democratic justice. I also have the joy of serving as president of the HLS Law and Philosophy Society, which co-sponsors this discussion. On behalf of our society, I would like to welcome you all. I would like to also welcome and give special thanks to our speakers for today, Professor Noam Chomsky and Professor Jon Hanson. We're very grateful for your presence. I would also like to thank our moderator, Michael Lehavi, an amazing 3L here at HLS and a member of our society's events board. This discussion will end at 6:15, but before that, we'll leave some time for Q&A. Thank you all for being here, and I'm looking forward to what is going to be a historic conversation. Michael?
Yeah, so I was asked to provide some brief context before we jump right into the questions, and the context is this. In my 1L year, I was afforded the tremendous privilege of interviewing Noam Chomsky. And in my 2L year, I was fortunate enough to take a corporations class with Professor Hanson. In that corporations class, I realized that a lot of what Chomsky says sounds like the same notes, perhaps hit with different instruments, as to what I learned from Chomsky, both in my interview with him and my studies of his work. So the idea behind the event here today is to get Hanson and Chomsky to converse with one another about their different views of society and corporate power and see where there's overlap and perhaps where there's some divergence. And with that, I think we're going to jump right into the first question. Professor Chomsky, we're going to start with question 1, and that's about manufacturing consent and some of Hanson's ideas. So in your famous work, you've explained how corporate ownership, advertising, biased sources, pressure from elites, and corporate-friendly ideology shape media content. In turn, you explain that this shapes the public's understanding of economic and political issues, fundamentally affecting their views. Similarly, Professor Hanson, you are known for critiquing the agentic, context-blind, dispositionist view lawmakers, jurists, and legal scholars commonly employ to subjugate certain groups within our society selectively. Professor Hanson, you further argue that a more just and accurate view of law and policy should pay closer attention to the situational forces that shape behavior and resist a more individualistic causal stories. To start off, what do you think the relationship is between these ideas? Maybe Professor Hanson, if you'd like to start us off.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, Professor Chomsky. What an honor to be here with you today. And I would love to take Michael's offer and talk about some of what I teach here in the law school and in my legal writing, and would love to hear your thoughts and what you would add to it. So I think what Professor Chomsky is saying when he speaks of manufactured consent is very much the same thing that I'm saying when I speak of dispositionism. And that's just a term that is not nearly as useful as and helpful as Professor Chomsky's, but it captures the idea that there is a story being told in the law about what causes outcomes. An implicit story, sometimes explicit story, about what causes outcomes. And that story has two parts, I would say. One part is the manufactured consent story. It's what I mean by dispositionism, and I didn't come up with this term. It was gifted to me from a whole bunch of social psychologists who have studied human behavior and characterized the basic psychological model that is common, especially in Western corporate captured cultures, as essentially dispositionist, which simply means people behave according to their preferences, according to their disposition. And so if anything good or bad happens to them, that good or bad thing is a consequence of their choice. They are responsible for what happened to them. And that story, in its simplicity, is the dominant cultural story we tell in this country, but also in the law, about when bad things happen to people. About those people. The people who have been hurt, the people who are suffering, the people on the have-not side of the spectrum, those people we tell a story about, and that story is not an accident. That story is, in my view, captured, and it's very much built into our legal stories. And our legal system is built on that story. But there is a second piece of that story, which I would call, just to keep it consistent with Professor Chomsky's idea, manufactured coercion. So the first story is, whatever happens to people, they've consented to it, and therefore they're responsible for it. And therefore, we owe them nothing. There is no obligation to them. Think of Sparky Abraham's comments about how people feel about debt earlier today. They blame themselves, right? That story leaves people dealing with the consequences of a system that is leaving them full of debt, and yet they internalize it to themselves, and the legal system reproduces that. But on the other side, there is another story, a second story, manufactured coercion. And that is the story we tell about large, powerful corporate actors that is every bit as much an illusion as the dispositionist story. And that story is that the major, powerful actors in our society have no real ability to change the system. They are powerless. And so we heard the various panelists earlier talking about the legal media and the idea of justices saying they are applying the law robot-like, as if it's the only outcome that can be reached if you apply good reasoning. We all know that's BS, but they pretend that they have no choice, that they're driven to that, and I'm sorry about the consequences, but the law is the law. And what large corporate actors do is tell the same story. They manufacture this coercion story, which is, look, we have to be responsive to the dispositions, the choice and the consent of consumers and give them what they want. We have to be responsive to the heavy regulatory hand of the state. We have to be responsive to our duty to shareholders. I mean, we are powerless in this situation. There is nothing we can do. And that that two-part story is what social psychologists explain as kind of like the ultimate attribution error. It's the way in which we tell stories that leave out group members who have been harmed accountable and responsible for their own harms, and leave in-group members who are powerful immune from any responsibility or accountability to those harms. Those are the stories we tell. Manufactured consent, we manufacture a story of consent and we sell that to them in countless ways in our culture and our legal system, and manufactured coercion. And that's part of how we manage to live in a system in which we pretend there is justice. But the pretense of justice is itself papered over with these stories, which if you examine, there's no truth to them.
Let me say, first of all, a word about the phrase manufacturing consent. It is the title of the book that Edward Herman and I wrote, called Manufacturing Consent. Ed Herman was professor of finance at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. We did not make up the phrase, we borrowed it. The phrase comes from Walter Lippmann, the leading public intellectual of the 20th century. Incidentally, a Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal. A similar phrase was used by Edward Bernays, the founder of the modern public relations industry. He called it engineering of consent. Both Lippmann and Bernays arrived at this concept through their participation in the first major government propaganda agency. You'll recall that Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1916 on the platform, "Peace without victory." The population did not want to get involved in the European war. Wilson had other ideas. He wanted to get involved, so he had to somehow find a way to convert a pacifist population into hysterical, raving, anti-German fanatics, and succeeded. The record is pretty astonishing. One of the ways in which this was achieved was by setting up a government propaganda agency. It was called the Committee on Public Information, which of course means disinformation. Didn't have to wait for Orwell to understand that. It's called the Creel Commission. And the Creel Commission had the task of basically disseminating tales that mostly they received from the British Ministry of Information, meaning disinformation, which was committed to trying to convince Americans to join the law. And plausibly, they targeted American intellectuals. They thought if they can convince the American intellectual community, they'll manage to bring the population along with them. And it worked. Both Lippmann and Bernays were very impressed by the success in manufacturing consent, radically changing the attitudes of Americans. Lippmann called this a new art in the practice of democracy. Both Bernays and Lippmann are talking, remember, from the liberal end of the spectrum, not the right end, which is much harsher. This is the soft liberal approach. Their idea, shared by other major liberal figures, Reinhold Niebuhr, Harold Lasswell, founder of modern political science, is, as they put it, the people are too stupid and ignorant to know what's good for them. The only ones who know what's good for them are we. We are the responsible men. We can make the decisions. And we have to be protected from the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd. That's Lippmann. we have to feed them with necessary illusions, emotionally potent oversimplifications, so they'll follow along. That's Reinhold Niebuhr. We should not be deluded by democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interest. They're not. We are. That's Harold Lasswell, founder of modern political science. All of this is from the liberal end of the spectrum. And out of that, one of the things that grew out of it is the world's greatest propaganda agency, public relations industry, which spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year to manufacture consent, to drive people to be dedicated to consumerism, not to pay attention to the affairs of the world, which are none of their business. Actually, the origins of this go back much further to David Hume, the first major work in what we would now call political science, his first principles of government 350 years ago. He opens the study of the first principles of government by expressing his wonder at what he calls the easiness by which the many are willing to subordinate themselves to the few. He says, it's very strange because power is in the hands of the governed. So why do they submit to the rule of the masters? He says, the answer to this miracle must be opinion, shaping of opinion and control of it, which somehow succeeds in bringing the population to subordinate themselves to the masters, the men of best quality, as they were called, or called themselves in his age. And this question, this dilemma, runs through a lot of modern history. In the modern period, the last century or so, the concept of manufacturing consent has been a dominant one in the liberal extreme of political and social theory, democratic theory, that runs right up till today. In our book, what we tried to do is discuss some of the mechanisms, put it very briefly, summarize, take the major media, their businesses, huge corporations, parts of bigger corporations. Like other businesses, they sell a product to a market. The market is advertisers. That's the business model for the media, other major corporations. The product is you and me, readers, viewers. So the fundamental, and of course they're all totally closely linked to government, personnel, contacts, commitments, background, and so on. So what you have is major corporations selling the public to other major corporations in close coordination with government. Then comes the obvious question. What do you expect to be the product that's produced? Reasonable expectations, something that reflects their interests, commitments, and concerns. And the rest of our book, in fact, the bulk of the book, and a lot of other work that both Ed Herman and I have done together and separately, is just investigating the evidence, seeing does it confirm this expectation. And you can judge for yourself, but I think it overwhelmingly confirms the expectation. So that's the concept of manufacture of consent, going back to David Hume, sharpened in the early 20th century as a new practice in the art of democracy to ensure that the public is marginalized, obedient, and so on. There are many further examples. Just to take one that's set much of the spirit of the current age, the neoliberal period of the last 40, 45 years, the 1960s were a period of significant activism on the part of young people mostly, many of them students, broke through a lot of conventions, commitments. The United States had some remarkably reactionary positions in the 1960s. A lot of us have forgotten that, but it's worth remembering. The 1960s, the United States had laws against miscegenation that were so extreme that the Nazis refused to accept them. Women still had not been admitted to be persons rather than property as they were for the founders. Blackstone's common law conception didn't happen till the 70s. Federal housing was by law segregated, which meant that maybe an Afro-American man could get a decent job at an auto plant in the 1950s, a major growth period. Couldn't buy a small house with it with a federal guarantee. It meant that the black population was excluded from the main source of wealth in the United States, which is home ownership. On and on like this. Anti-sodomy laws, strong support for aggression, almost no criticism of it. It was a very different country. Well, the change came about through the civilizing effect of the activism of the 60s, civil rights, anti-war movements, the feminist beginnings of the feminist movement and others. This was considered to be very dangerous by elite opinion. It's called, in fact, the time of troubles. Something went wrong in the 60s. And there were reactions from the far right and from what's called the left. The left is much more interesting. The most interesting publication has to do with manufacture of consent, which I urge you to read if you haven't done it, is a book called The Crisis of Democracy, which was published by the Trilateral Commission, liberal internationalists from Europe, Japan, and the United States. The American rapporteur was a Harvard professor, Samuel Huntington, liberal professor of the science of government at Harvard. The general attitudes are basically that of the Carter administration. In fact, the whole Carter administration was drawn from their ranks. What they said is there is a crisis of democracy. There's too much democracy. The public, which is supposed to be passive and obedient, is becoming engaged in the public arena, pressing for their demands. Young people, old people, women, workers, farmers, basically the population. They're called special interests. They were trying to enter the public arena. Doesn't work. Too much pressure on the state. So what they have to learn is more moderation in democracy. Go back to passivity and obedience. Don't try to rock the boat. We, the sensible men, will run it. And notice that one group is excluded here, the business world. They're not a special interest. They're the national interest. So they can continue with their massive influence over policy. In fact, grew substantially in the 70s. Lobbying just exploded, other means. They did discuss the universities. Samuel Huntington wrote the section on this. He described the universities as institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. His phrase. They're not doing their job. They're not indoctrinating the young properly. That's why you have these kids out in the streets opposing the war, calling for women's rights and so on. So we have to ensure that the universities, the media, are much more under control and do not permit these troubles to be continued. Remember, again, this is the liberal end of the spectrum. It's much harsher when you go to the right, things like, say, Powell Memorandum and others. Well, so now that you're a Harvard student, you know what your task is. The institution is responsible for indoctrinating you properly. And unless they do it properly, you might get too engaged and too involved in public affairs, which is none of your business. You're supposed to follow the rules. You know? Well, that's the contemporary conception of manufactured consent. Goes right to the present. And you see it in many ways. So, for example, take, say, the war in Iraq, the worst crime of the 20th century, of the 21st century, of this century, by far the worst crime. How is it treated at, say, Harvard? Well, Harvard right now is being praised because Harvard actually had a debate about the nature of the war. It was moderated by Samantha Power, Kennedy School. The debate was about whether the Iraq war qualifies as humanitarian intervention. Just ask yourself for a moment. Suppose there was a debate at Moscow University as to whether the special military operation in Ukraine qualifies as a humanitarian intervention. We'd collapse in ridicule. But when it happens here, we respect it. You've followed, I'm sure, the recent flap about Kenneth Roth at the Kennedy School. He's being honored for the fact that he took the negative position. He said it doesn't qualify as humanitarian intervention. How would we react if some professor at Moscow University said, well, the Iraq war doesn't qualify as humanitarian intervention? I mean, the question can't possibly arise. But manufacture of consent is so deep-seated, so effective, that the question isn't even raised. Look at the whole discussion about this all over the news recently, all over Harvard. Do you find ridicule of the fact that this even happened? No, we accept it. That means the institutions responsible for indoctrination are doing their job. Find case after case like this, all in front of us. These are things we should be aware of. We want to understand the world, understand the way the rest of the world looks at us, understand how our framework of thinking is shaped and modified, not just by media, but by the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, like the universities.
Professor Hanson, would you like to respond?
Essentially, just a few thoughts that came to mind while Professor Chomsky was sort of detailing some aspects of the history and application of the concept of manufactured consent. I just wanted to identify a few different categories of what I think that means that might be worth thinking about. At some level, when we talk about manufactured consent, we talk about this idea of advertising, or, the billions spent on advertising, where there are those, or propaganda of some sort, where there are those who are committed to turning, our wants into needs and our indifference into wants, like just to sort of level us up by creating something in us that makes us want something. That's one form of manufactured consent, right? This manufactured choice notion. Another way in which I think it happens, and we've seen some illustrations of it in our earlier conversations today, is to do things to the environment, to people to take advantage or create material needs on the part of individuals, or psychological needs on the part of individuals, to do those things situationally. And then when the behavior results as a consequence of those situational, contextual manipulations, you interpret it as consent. You call that consent. So some discussion today about tobacco. Here's a company, here's an industry that has made billions and billions of dollars around the world by addicting often young people and engaging in all kinds of situational manipulations that are situational on one hand, but to which they then assign a story. And that's why tobacco becomes a defender of freedom and choice, right? They're really becoming a defender of this idea of consent, right? Because consent is doing something in that story that is inoculating them from the consequences of their manipulations. And that's a form of manufactured consent. But we also heard this many times today when law students said, I came to law school because I wanted to pursue some career that would help me make the world a better place, and then not really knowing exactly how it happened, I'm going to big law next year, right? And what we see in the stories we tell at law school among most of my colleagues is, well, they came to their senses. Not the material needs that we created for them, the status, the psychological sort of elements of creating stories about what is good law, what's the best way to get training, what's your level of debt. Those are all situational manipulations, but we provide to them a story of consent, right? And that's manufactured consent. And then there's also a third level, a deeper level, I think, where the whole idea of consent is manufactured. This whole notion that consent, as we perceive it, unexamined, should be perceived as a means of legitimating outcomes, a means of justifying what happens in a circumstance. That if we can just spray a little consent paint on top of something, we can look away. Right? We can blame it on the individual or the group that's disadvantaged. That notion of consent has been more or less robust over the course of history, at least since the Enlightenment, but it really, really came on post-World War II, when some of the earlier stories that we had used to justify inequality and relative advantage and disadvantage had lost their own legitimacy. So stories of race, racial injustice that had existed was justified at the time. Racial inequalities were justified in time through race science, for example, and eugenics. Stories that we were told that would make sense of those things and make us feel okay about it, or biological differences between men and women. These were stories that were dominant that completely lost their legitimacy post-World War II for lots of reasons that should be obvious. Well, there was a need at that moment for a new story. And consent as a concept was elevated, right? In that sense, that deeper sense, there is a manufactured consent, this creation of a notion of consent that would do all of this work. And if you think about what neoliberalism is, consistent with what tobacco was doing, they're very much in sync. It is the elevation of this notion of consent to justify the harms that are being produced by our system and to legitimate what otherwise would make us say, wait a minute, this is unjust. But when we spray that over it, many people feel okay about it, especially in elite places like this.
I'm going to take the liberty of moving to our second question. That's question number 2, Professor Chomsky. This is in the domain of ethics and activism. So Professor Hanson has claimed that people are predisposed to experience what he calls a justice anxiety when faced with injustice. He's argued that This justice anxiety explains the symbolism of legal institutions like this one and the often winding, incoherent justifications prevalent throughout law. In my view, similarly, Professor Chomsky has asserted that there is a biological endowment that in effect requires us to develop a system of moral judgment and a theory of justice with a detailed applicability over an enormous range. I'm less familiar with Chomsky's views regarding how our biologically endowed morality takes shape in the world and how our moral faculties can lead to injustice. I'm wondering how your two views intersect and how they might inform theories of change on the ground, and I think it might make sense for Professor Chomsky to start us off.
Well, first of all, just a point of logic. If we make any moral judgments, and of course we do, it can only be because we have some innate concept of morality. If we didn't have that, we could never make any moral judgment. Again, that's a point that goes back to David Hume, since I mentioned him before. As he pointed out famously, the experimental, what he called experimental reasoning, the ability to draw any conclusions from data, has to be based on what he called instinct, what we would call innate capacity. Otherwise, the data tells you nothing. You could just record the data. In fact, you can't even record the data unless you have innate structure. Obvious example of this is language. You take an infant, newborn infant, and its pet dog, a puppy, chimpanzee, whatever. They're getting the same sounds, same noises, but the pet just hears noise. The infant hears language from the first days because it's constructed, it's built so that it interprets noises, some of them as being language. You can't even have data unless you have internal structure. And you can draw no conclusions from the data unless you also have internal structure. So the fact that there's the idea that there's a biological basis for moral judgment shouldn't be controversial, because it's basically just a point of logic, nothing to discuss, at least been clear since Hume at least. Well, the next question is, what is it? Actually, this topic was open to investigation not that long ago by a graduate student in philosophy. His name was Jon Hanson. He's now a professor at Georgetown Law School. He wrote a PhD thesis, which was a critical analysis of John Rawls's famous theory of justice. Rawls, as he pointed out, actually I know this from personal discussion, we were friends back in the 60s. His original approach was based on linguistic models. He gave that up under very sharp criticism, but Mikhail picked it up, rebutted the criticisms, developed it, and tried to develop something like a generative grammar of morality. He also introduced some experimental work jointly with some experimental psychologists at MIT, Elizabeth Spelke, and later this work was picked up by Mark Hauser, another Harvard professor who's done several books on it. And by now we have some information for the first time based on cross-cultural inquiry, study with children, about what innate morality might be, just the bare beginnings of this inquiry. It's got a long way to go, but it's made progress in the last few years. Well, of course, our conceptions of what's moral changes radically over time. I just gave some examples before. So what was considered moral and right in the 1960s is considered unspeakable today. And if you go back further, the differences are even sharper. That shouldn't be surprising. That's true of every innate capacity, every single one. If we're speaking English, not Swahili. Actually, fundamentally, it's the same. Some Martian scientist looking at us would regard these as very superficial differences. For our lives, of course, they're significant. Same is true of vision, walking, anything you find. Early experience shapes and selects innate capacities and determines their characteristics, and they can change over time, superficially. Notice that what's important to us as living organisms is the differences among us. What would be of interest to a scientist looking at us is the similarities. We don't pay any attention to them, we just take them for granted. Like what's interesting to us about a group of frogs is how different they are. As far as the frogs are concerned, how much the same they are. As far as the frogs are concerned, they're very different. This one's very different than that one. The organism itself looks at the differences among them, takes for granted the commonality. As a scientist, we take the opposite point of view. We're interested in the commonality, not the superficial differences. And this would be true when we study the basis of morality too. Well, there's a long way to go in advancing this topic. It's very hard because among the prevalent, very common prevalent beliefs is that it's all learned, it's all cultural, nothing common. Take postmodern movement and says there's no human nature, we're all just cultural objects. That's beyond insanity. Couldn't possibly be true, otherwise we'd be shapeless amoebas, amoeboid creatures. So it can't possibly be true for reasons that were evident as far back as Hume, but that leaves us with barriers to studying the topic. Can be studied. So, and we will find, of course, superficial differences as to what counts as just and unjust. They change over time with greater comprehension of our own basic nature, which does extend over time. I think that's the major picture that we have to keep in mind when we think about these topics.
Professor Hanson?
First, I don't disagree with any of that, but I am agnostic about some of the source of these, our sense of morality, our sense of justice. And that agnosticism is born mostly of ignorance. I just haven't studied it the way Professor Chomsky has, but he makes good sense as always. I want to talk about a related question, which is, where is justice in law? Because we know where we see it. It's on the outside of every building of law. It's on the website of every law school. Right? It's in the mission statement of every law school. It's on the ABA and other professional logos. Justice is everywhere on the surface of law. And there's a reason for that, and I think it may go to this fact that there is something about justice that is special, which is we care about it. It's one of these terms or notions that you know it when you feel it. And yet when you get to law and you get to legal education, you will find zero conversation about justice. If you press on that question, even if it was the question that brought you to law school, you will be told irrelevant. Right? That's not for us. And furthermore, no one knows how to define it, so we've got to rely on something else. So here we have a system that is celebrating and valorizing and selling justice to the world. And then when people come to it to learn how to do justice, they're told, you can't buy that here. We're not selling that. because we don't have a definition. Well, if I were a lawyer, and thankfully I'm not, I would say that's fraud. If I were just a person with a roommate, I would say that was a fucking lie. You're lying. Why are you selling justice? And if you can't define justice, get on it. Don't not talk about it. I think justice is not that hard to define as a feeling. When we perceive injustice, we know it. Justice is the relationship with injustice, which is often felt. And I did a lot of work over years with Jacob Lipton, and we looked everywhere we could where people talked about justice or when they felt injustice, in history and philosophers and journalistic accounts and in legal cases. And we thought we noticed a set of patterns, a framework for when people perceive injustice. And it turns out people tend to perceive injustice when they believe they are witnessing power producing harm or inequality without legitimacy. And when people perceive injustice, power, leading to harm without legitimacy, they stand up. It mobilizes them. It's a very different kind of feeling. I mean, we're lazy, let's face it. But when we perceive injustice, we get moving. I heard Josie Duffy Rice earlier today talking about the fact that the kind of the fatigue associated with the problem of being close to the criminal legal system and never losing that sense of anger that comes from seeing the injustice in reality. That stays with us. That's really a powerful force. Justice is special. No wonder we sell it. We know it's important, but we don't define it. We have a framework for it. And here I think some of what Professor Chomsky said about changing notions of justice or morality over time are consistent with my view. The problem of defining power, producing inequality or harm without legitimacy is dependent on a set of perceptions. And those perceptions can vary over time or across people or groups. Notice the three things we don't study in law school. Power. We don't study power in law school. We don't spend any time studying inequality or its underlying causes, or making people proximate, close to harm. We distance them from it by using abstract doctrinal categories and terminologies. And we certainly don't examine what are the elements of legitimacy, the procedures that we say legitimate outcomes, or the stories that we tell. We don't interrogate those to see if they're actually legitimating or simply create the illusion of legitimacy, perceived legitimacy. And so it's very possible for people to have a different conception of what is just and unjust because they have different perceptions of power in its relationship to harm and in its relationship to legitimacy. We could be serious about justice, but it would require our being serious about understanding power in all its different forms. For example, the subtle situational forces to which we attribute people's consent and their choice, right? Those subtle situational forces are a form of power. We could study underlying causes of systemic harms. We will not talk about systemic harms in law school because we are a totally individualized system. Individuals suffering bring individual cases using individual doctrinal strategies, more or less. Well, you can't get to systems that way. And so no wonder if you look at our systems in the world, our legal system is helping to produce them, and we certainly have very little purchase over our response. And we could study very closely whether the legitimating stories we tell should be given the credit they are. Does it matter what it might have meant to this generation what they might have thought this word meant in a text? Really? And are you sure that you know? Are you historians? Are you really doing your law and economic analysis well, or are you making stuff up? We yearn to tell stories that make sense of things, but in a legal system that is captured by corporate interests and other powerful interests, the stories that win are the ones that favor those powerful corporate interests. And that's the advantage of being powerful. But that's why stories matter, and that's why counter-narratives matter, etc. So I'll stop there.
Well, I think the emphasis on power and its shaping of the concept of legitimacy is a very critical one. I might just quote a close friend of David Hume's, who, at the origins of the capitalist system, pointed out that what he called the masters of mankind, the people who own the economy, he's talking about England, of course, the merchants and manufacturers of England, are the principal architects of state policy, the law, and other institutions, and they make sure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, however grievous the effect on the people of England or others. It's Adam Smith, another early insight into the nature of our world, and it remains true to the present.
Okay, moving on to question number 3, and if we could keep the responses within 5-6 minutes, that would leave enough time for the Q&A. In light of recent comments...
Haven't mine been short? I'm sorry.
In light of recent comments from Justices Kagan, Roberts, and Alito, what is your opinion on the potential dangers of the public losing faith in the court? Some liberal thinkers have pointed out that the perception of the court's legitimacy is of such great importance to our liberal order that a facade of legitimacy may be worth the costs of norm erosion. Such thinkers might point to the collapse of judicial independence in Poland as an example. What do you make of these concerns? Professor Hanson, if you'd like to start us off.
I can be really short. I can jump in a minute, but I would just start with Samuel Alito is an idiot.
Professor Chomsky.
Well, I'll be brief too. Look at another question. It's true that the public attitudes towards the court and its legitimacy are declining, but that happens to be true of all institutions. Public faith in Congress, the president, science, intellectual life, just run across the board, declining very sharply. The question we should be asking is, what's happening to the institutional framework in which we live that is causing the population to lose any faith in its legitimacy? That's the question we ought to be asking. And that takes us back to the neoliberal assault that has been launched against the population for 40 years, 45 years. Big topic, many effects. Illegitimacy of the court is one aspect.
I can give a little bit longer. I just thought that what Professor Chomsky just emphasized is so true. And that one way of thinking about the legitimacy of our system is it's when inequalities or harm become particularly salient, and or the power that is producing those inequalities or harms become particularly salient, and when the stories we tell to justify that power, the hierarchy, and those harms no longer have credibility, when they are no longer legitimate, that the whole system begins to be perceived as unjust. What I think Sam Alito is saying is, shh. Don't tell them. We shouldn't talk about the fact that our system is unjust. Now, he's not doing that consciously thinking I'm going to be lying. He actually believes in the justice of the system. But he's also created a life and lives within an institution in which he has distanced himself from the power, the inequality, and its lack of legitimacy. And he is totally advantaged by the system. And that's the same thing that's going on with many actors in our system. And many of those actors and the institutions they represent, as Professor Chomsky underscores, are also facing a legitimacy crisis. So this conference about the corporate capture of the legal system, you can say the corporate capture of many, many things now. And that's something you could say today and draw an audience that you couldn't say as effectively 20, 30 years ago. Right? That's a shift. And that's an important shift. And it's a moment also, and maybe I'll just end on this. I mean, this is a moment, an opportunity, the very opportunity that Sam Alito doesn't want you taking seriously. An opportunity to reimagine the system, to do something, to push while it's vulnerable, to look at the examples of some of the earlier panels we've had today. Molly Coleman, People's Parity Project. Or Jay Willis with Balls and Strikes, whose job is to tell stories that delegitimate the Supreme Court, in effect. Or any number of these efforts and institutions that people are building and the coalitions they're building. Like, this would be the moment that you'd want to wake up and get busy. And I'll end on that.
I want to briefly advocate for the devil, because we have some time before the Q&A. How would you two respond to the idea that an unjust order might be preferable to a just disorder, which I think is the heart of the concern over the facade of legitimacy being worth the costs of ignoring illegitimacy?
I'll defer to Professor Chomsky on that first.
I don't think the question arises. A just society will be one in which people participate with commitment, deliberation. It will be a well-ordered society. The social order is breaking down in many respects, and it's a consequence of the perceived illegitimacy of institutions. That's why you had things like January 6th, for example, sign of one of the many signs of the breakdown of the social order. That's why you have anti-vax movements and other things. So what the fact of the matter is that it's the injustice, the supreme extreme inequality that Professor Hanson mentioned, that is creating a sense of illegitimacy, social disorder, breakdowns, antisocial behavior. So the real point, I think, is the lack of justice helps create disorder. Real justice would lead to participation in a more effectively functioning society. And we should be aware of the extent of the robbery of the public in the last 40 years or so. It's not small. Rand Corporation did a study a couple of months ago of what they call the transfer of wealth. Robbery would be a better term for it. The transfer of wealth from the lower 90% of the income level to the top 1. Roughly $50 trillion. It's not small change. That's highway robbery on a significant scale. A lot of it designed by economists and the political actors who picked up their ideas in order to create a radically unequal, unjust world, which is creating all kinds of social collapse and social disorder.
I'd want to respond to that question as well, if I may. Such a good question, and I would just say it connects to the Sam Alito thing. I think what Sam may be saying captures a widespread sense that really challenging the legitimacy of our system is fraught. That really examining that question is a frightening one. It further undermines the legitimacy of the system. But look at what we've purported to do. We have claimed in our society and our legal system to have constructed an institution that would ensure justice above all else. And then, when the injustice produced by that system becomes so clear that many people begin pushing back, there is a collective response, typically among those who are most powerful, to say, don't go there. That's not just them, though. Everyone feels it because it's very destabilizing. Violence is right on the edge because we know that those advantaged in our system will fight to maintain their advantage. And they will use force where manufactured consent before that had done the trick. Right? So the illusory consent then becomes actual violence in a very visible way. We've got it already, but it intensifies, it widens. That's scary stuff. Can you imagine a system that's doing that? Like, how could we settle for that? I thought this was some kind of social contractarian notion. Oh, again, manufactured consent. Like, where is the contract here? The contract was, if you're going to have all this power, state, you're going to produce a system that is just. Absent that, you should either get out of the way or reform yourself fundamentally to ensure that you deliver on the promises that you gave. That's just contract law. Again, not a lawyer. Pretty sure that's contract law. So it's worth our thinking about that very feeling that I think is widespread. I, for one, would vote for a system that is just, and I would also call upon many of us, many of you, to think about how do you produce that justice by working together and thinking about how you avoid some of the problems. And I think disempowering corporations is one key starting point for changing the dynamic that's produced a result in which we're not even allowed to talk about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court.
And with that, we'll move to the Q&A. Thank you so much, Professor Hanson. So the process is raise your hand, and I'll call you out, and someone with a mic will run to you and get your question heard. The gentleman in the front here.
My name is Giordano. Thank you for having this conversation, hosting it, and facilitating it. I'm interested in the last part of the second part of the conversation, where Professor Hanson talks about unraveling what we refer to as manufactured consent. And I'm interested to know what's on the other side of that ledge. I think that the answer to a lot of the questions, especially what Professor Hanson said and some of what Professor Chomsky said in his last part, is a change in jurisprudence. I think that if we take, for example, Thomas or the originalists seriously, we engage in history, but not from the main, but from the margins of history, from those that weren't captured by the ledger. thereby changing how we engage law itself, whether it's a legal person or whether we consider the notion of rights. I'm interested to know if you can have a conversation about what it would do for either Supreme Court decisions that we've had in the past or even for jurisprudence in general.
Maybe Professor Hanson, if you can start us off.
So, wonderful question. I think one way of thinking about what's on the other side of manufactured consent is something closer to actual consent where you're really examining the circumstances. So think about the way we treat, like the labor contract is fully consensual because, hey, it's a contract without real examination. Sort of a typical example that's been with us for centuries. What is wage slavery and what is free choice? That debate entails a legal system asking that question where it's really looking at power dynamics. But I also think examining that question with power dynamics in mind is not enough, because where there is profound inequality or even significant inequality, there is power dynamic in anything that we otherwise call consensual. And yet we are comfortable in a system pretending that contract and negotiations and consent is all fine despite significant inequalities across the parties that are supposedly bargaining on equal footing. They're not. They're bargaining very different footing. We should be calling for more equality, not just because we might prefer an egalitarian world, and that's a good thing, but because our mechanisms themselves work more effectively. They are truer to their purported ends when there is equality. We should demand equality so that contract works, right? And similarly, when we think about making a system more democratic, it is more democratic when there is less asymmetry across the parties who are supposedly represented. So the topic of are corporations people and should they have so much political power has come up many times today. That is highly inconsistent with the notion of meaningful democracy, for example. So this idea of equalizing so that our systems work more effectively is key. But I take your point also, which is who's in these spaces and who's making these judgments and whose histories or stories are being told. We have pretended to know the answer to those questions by keeping the circle relatively small of the people making the judgments about those questions and creating institutions in which those people are insulated to serve those in power. So to change the inequalities and make things more equal, it would also begin to change those institutions, but we have to be conscious about it. Let's change who's in these places, right? And let's change the stories that are dominant. And there I really like your idea of marginal histories as being a starting point. Anyway, hope that was helpful.
Professor Chomsky?
Well, just a word about the labor contract, which is a core principle of modern society, and in fact a dramatic illustration of how manufacturing consent has worked. Of course, to talk about the labor contract as negotiations freely undertaken is beyond absurdity. There's a boss and a worker. The worker has the choice of taking the job or starving. The employer has the choice of employing you or employing someone else. To call that an equal negotiation it doesn't reach the level of comedy. Of course, if there is organization of workers, unions, then you could move towards something, maybe not equal, but at least some kind of balance. That's exactly why the neoliberal era, beginning with Reagan, began, both in the United States and in Britain, with a major attack on unions, since both understood we're going to carry out an assault against the population. The $50 trillion that I mentioned is one aspect of it. We've got to ensure that people can't defend themselves. Therefore, we have to eliminate the one means of defense that is available to them, organizing in unions, which opened the door to a major corporate assault on unions, much of it illegal. But when you have a criminal state, it doesn't matter. You can carry out illegal acts with impunity. This goes back to the origins of what's now called neoliberalism. Austria in the 1920s, the guru of what's called libertarianism in the United States, Ludwig von Mises, could barely contain his euphoria when the proto-fascist Austrian state destroyed the unions violently, destroyed social democracy. In fact, von Mises praised Mussolini in nearby Italy for saving civilization by smashing the unions and social democracy so that the laws of sound economics, as it was called, could prevail. The laws of sound economics do establish a labor contract in which you have a boss with all the power and a worker with no power who freely consent that the worker will not starve to death. And in fact, it's interesting to see how attitudes have changed. You go back to the late 19th century, early industrial revolution, American workers were militantly, vigorously opposed to imposition of the labor contract. They called it wage slavery. In fact, this was such a popular position that it was a plank of the Republican Party, Lincoln's Republican Party, not today's, that wage labor is tolerable only temporarily until a person regains his freedom. The Knights of Labor, the first great labor movement, was based on the principle that those who work in the mills should own them, not service to a boss, not slavery for most of your life, which is an attack on our fundamental rights and our sense of dignity. Well, a century later, it's taken for granted that this is legitimate. Now, what was regarded as an intolerable assault on rights and dignity is now regarded as your highest aspiration, to get a job and spend your waking life at the service of a master. That's a very effective, successful achievement of the process of manufacturing consent.
Thank you so much for that response. I'm going to give Professor Hanson the opportunity to make one more remark, and we're at 6:13, so that might be our closing remark as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Professor Chomsky. I just think I wanted to connect back to some of the things that Professor Chomsky has said and that have been said here today. So when he spoke about the Powell Memo in 1971, in which Lewis Powell really wrote a call to action on the part of large corporate interests to come together and to be, in essence, unionize, to actively influence and capture educational institutions, colleges and universities, the media, and the judiciary, and saw in those institutions enemies which he portrayed as unjust threats to big business. He was playing the justice card, right? He was saying there is power in the part of these people in the media and in universities and in the judiciary. Think Warren Court, not great, but much better, that were a threat to business, and we need to mobilize to come together. And what the right has done unbelievably successfully is to mobilize and unionize and come together and build coalitions and effectively capture all of our systems. And if you want to know how you can begin to respond to that, don't think, oh, shit, it's just too daunting and they're too big and they have too completely captured the system. Just take a lesson from them. They were taking a lesson from many of the movements before them, right, that they were responding to. This is a time to come together, to organize, to build institutions, to work in coalitions, to try to push back. Again, as the examples from earlier today are just illustrations of. It should be, in my opinion, a defining element of this generation. And that corporate power should be a primary target in that. And I think that's where I'll end. I am honored to be here, really pleased to have so many of you here today. Turn it over to Michael and Eleftheria, who can end it for us.
Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky, Professor Hanson, Michael, for your time and a discussion that we will always remember. Thank you to our audience for their insightful contributions. And we look forward to seeing you at our society's forthcoming events. The conference will reconvene tomorrow, Saturday at 9:30 a.m. That is registration. The first event is at 10. We hope you enjoyed this discussion and we wish you a great evening. Thank you.